All right, good afternoon. Glad to have you here today. Today we're talking about we're Adventist churches, about creating walls. When I grew up, I didn't know what the Lamb of God was. I didn't know what grace was unless I tripped. And my dad would say, "Way to go, Grace." Or the other thing was if we were at Thanksgiving dinner and somebody would say, "Hey, Grandpa, would you say grace?" And all I knew that was a really long prayer. I didn't know what the grace of God was. I didn't know what a Savior was. I never heard the term Jesus Christ unless it was in the form of a swear word. And I wonder, where do people hear those things and where do they really go to understand some of those things? So I think sometimes Adventism creates walls for people to understand the message. And you have to understand that some of those are intentional because of the things we believe, but some of them are unintentional. Adventism, I don't believe, was created to build walls, but to tear walls down so people could find Jesus. So let's take a look at some of those things where we build some of those walls. So first, when you think about finding Jesus, how important it is to understand who he is, where he is, how much he loves us, how much he's done to save us. That's so important for us to understand. But we do all kinds of things. I had a lady that came to my church for about 2 years. When she asked me one day, she was a young adult, I was a young adult pastor, my wife was standing beside me, and she said, "Raj, who is Alan B. White?" I'm thinking to myself, Alan, you've been coming to this church for 2 years and you think Ellen is Alan? How did you, and Alan B. White, you don't even know? You haven't seen it in print or anything? How does that happen? I think of the GC. What does that mean when you talk about people who, see that? What are we doing when we talk about that? I think we need a culture that unpacks some of the language that we use, this traditional language within an Adventist subculture, to make it available for everybody else. And I think of a story of a lady that her husband was on the General Conference Executive Committee and went to the 2015 General Conference session in San Antonio. And she came back and wanted to give a report. And she came to our first service and she shared the report about the GC this and the GC that and the Executive Committee did this and on she goes. And I said to her afterwards, I said, "Virginia, could you do it a little differently at the second service?" She says, "How's that?" I said, "Would you just take just a little longer? Because 20% of our audience aren't Adventists, and another 20% are brand new Adventists. So could you take a little bit and explain what the GC is?" So I would recommend you say, at the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, the world governing body of the denomination, we were at their General Conference meeting where we made decisions, and she did it better than I just did, but she explained herself and she walked through it and she did really good. But we do all kinds of things. We talk about the potluck. I don't know why we have pots of luck, but I tell my congregation, we're going to have lunch together. It's potluck style, but it's lunch. And I think it's something that people understand a little better. We used to call it cradle roll. People still call it cradle roll, even though it's been the beginner's class in the denominational literature for years and years. But we still call it cradle roll. And I remember the first time I heard it, I'm thinking, why are we rolling cradles around? When I was a brand new person coming to church, I wasn't even an Adventist yet. I was about 12 years old, and I saw this old lady. She says to another old lady, and she calls her a dork. And I'm like, "You're not supposed to do that in church, call people dorks." And my mom had to explain to me what dork us is. They used to serve a food to us called New Tina. I often wondered what happened to the old Tina. There's Loam and Linda, and I want to know what Linda's doing in the dirt. And then there's turn in your tithes and your offerings. But we do it in other ways. We talk about my favorite author. Someone will get up front and they'll say, "Well, my favorite author says this." And when I was a new Christian, I wanted to say, "Okay, but who is your favorite author? I want to know." Because I didn't know that was a euphemism for Ellen White. We do this all the time when we talk about the Lamb of God, the Savior of the world, all these kinds of things. But we do it, those are some of the unintentional things that we do. We also do it in intentional reasons. We talk about the Sabbath. We don't just talk about Saturday, we talk about the Sabbath. We talk about Jesus being the intercessor. We talk about the state of the dead. But what we're doing is we're trying to say, but what happens to you when you die is that you don't go straight to heaven, but you stay resting in the grave until Jesus comes. But I wonder if we would talk about the state of dead people and what is the truth of it. And maybe not get rid of some of our common catchphrases, but the second coming, the prophetic movement. We talk about the grace of Jesus Christ, but what if we could get people to really understand that grace saves us and grace changes us from the inside out, and that it is God that moves upon us. See, we're trying to proclaim a message that needs to be reached by everybody we come in contact with. It's a message that's life-changing. It's a message that adjusts people's thinking, and if we block it with some of the barriers that we put up front, now we have to start talking about breaking down some of those barriers. So we talk about the literal, visible second coming of Christ, the audible, the glorious second coming of Christ. We've been talking about how we've been given a prophetic movement. And, how do we express that in a way that makes sense? Because if you stop and think about us as a denomination, we do a lot of things differently. We have a different health system, we have a different health care, we have a different educational system, we have different printing presses, we have different ways of doing evangelism. We used to have different music with chapel music, we have different food. I tell people we go to church on the wrong day, we die wrong, we go to heaven wrong. We do all these things differently than everybody else. And so how do we affect that? I think of a friend of mine. She was not an Adventist when she showed up at an Adventist church. She had just recently married an Adventist guy, and he was on his way back to church. And she shows up at church, her first Sabbath in an Adventist church. She grew up in a Baptist family, and she comes to church. She's excited about church. She's excited that her new husband wants to go to church, and she's very, outgoing, talkative kind of person. And she talks as she's going through the line, and she's sitting in the potluck line, the lunch line, where all this food is lined up. And Baptists do potlucks, they do potlucks just as well as Adventists do. And she's looking at it, and she's got her plate, she got her silverware, and she's looking down the line. She says, okay, that's potato salad, is that fish? And the lady behind her taps her on the back, and she says, oh, honey, this is an Adventist potluck. She didn't know what an Adventist potluck was, and she turns around to the lady and she says, so is it fish? It's a barrier to stop and think. I'm not saying we shouldn't have vegetarian potlucks, but I am saying we need to explain it so people understand it. We assume when we come to church that everybody understands everything we're saying. We assume that everybody is in favor of what we're saying. We assume that we don't have to explain things. But like I said recently, my church has 20% of its audience that are non-churched people or at least non-Adventist people. And 20% are brand new Adventists and just kind of made a decision through an evangelistic series. They don't know all the history. They don't know all the culture yet. We have to stop and explain it. My wife gets on me when I get up front and I'm preaching, and I'll say, well, you all know the story of David and Goliath. Let's go into it a little bit. And she says, no, not everybody does know the story of David and Goliath. I remember when I was a brand new Christian, my parents bought the blue Bible story books, and my next door neighbor, he was the same age as I was, he saw them at my house. He said, could I take one of those and read them? He was looking through the pictures and picture on every page and, for these full color pictures stuff. And he says, could I take it? And he took the first volume, and he comes back to me about a week later. He says, Raj, did you know there was this giant flood, and this guy made this big boat. They called it, They called it an ark, and there was this giant flood over the whole world, and a guy by the name of Noah built a boat. I said, and I looked at him. I'd known him for about 2 weeks before. I said, of course I knew, but he didn't know. I think of my brother-in-law. When he said to my sister-in-law when they were dating, he says, do you really believe all that stuff about Noah and being swallowed by a fish and Jonah? Come on, really? We live in a culture where the stories of the Bible are either not familiar or are unbelievable to the average person watching. Don't mishear me. We can learn how to say it differently. We can learn to do it in a way that makes sense to everybody around. If you're not being asked questions on Sabbath mornings about what that story was about, either you're number one, you're not listening, or number two, you don't have any non-Adventists visiting. And that both of those are a problem. Both of them are a huge problem because we need to be regularly rubbing shoulders with non-Seventh-day Adventists. Otherwise, we don't know how to explain it to them. The average Adventist member doesn't have any friends outside of the church after about 5 years. The only friends they really hang out with are other church members. Listen, this needs to be repeated from the front over and over and over, because the culture of a church is that we lose our vision about every 28 days. And after 28 days, if nobody's been repeating the vision, if nobody's been pushing the vision about explaining who we are and what we're about and explaining the stories and coming at things from the basic get-go, people begin to just treat church like it's a country club. It's just a good place to come hear good talk and just to remind me of my values. But I'll do stuff all the time in my sermons, and I'll say, turn to the book of Mark, Matthew, Mark, and I'll repeat it like that. Or I'll say, turn to the book of Ephesians. It comes right after, and I'll talk about it, Or I always make a joke, turn to 1 Peter. You can always find 1 Peter because it comes right before 2 Peter. But I'm explaining to people that there's multiple books in Scripture, and I'm trying to teach them how to find their way around. So I want to take you to this concept of looking at people in a way that makes sense to them, and so that we can understand who they are. A friend of mine developed this grid that I'm about to put on the screen, but I want to read you a couple of quotes first. A couple of quotes from the book of Evangelism. First one said, methods must be improved. There must be no fixed rules. Our work is a progressive work, and there must be room left for methods to be improved upon. But under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, unity must and will be preserved. See, the author of that, Ellen White, is trying to get us to push forward, to say, don't just do it like it's always been done. Think through what you're doing. Try to improve, make it better, get better and better at it, and make it work even more effectively. Here's another one. Different methods from the past. Means will be devised to reach hearts. Some of the methods used in this work will be different from the methods used in the past, but let no one, because of this, block the way by criticism. When we talk about reaching people for the kingdom, we have to understand that today's generation thinks differently than previous generations. We have to understand that the method of reaching them might be a little different than the way we've done it in the past. Now, please don't misunderstand me. What I'm saying is the message stays the same. We have to keep the message. We've been called as a Seventh-day Adventist church to proclaim a message that is truth-filled and pure, and we need to preach it loud and clear. But how do we preach it? Are we using a language that is understandable? One of my favorite groups that I like to liken this to is Adventist Frontier Missions. And Adventist Frontier Missions goes into a remote part of the world, and they set up a home. The missionary will set up a home, and you can't tell the difference between that home and anybody else's home in the area. They have the locals build it for them, and they begin to learn the language, and then they begin to try to understand the culture so that they can proclaim the message of Jesus in a way they understand. We like to think that the United States and Canada were Christian background and Christian nations, but it's not that way anymore. And we have to find a way to proclaim the same message so people will understand it. Here's another quote. New life in old methods. Men are needed who pray to God for wisdom and who, under the guidance of God, can put new life into old methods of labor and can invent new plans and new methods of awakening the interests of church members and reaching the men and women of the world. So I want to take you to this grid, this 4-part grid. As you see it on your screen, there's these 4 white blocks, and I want to take you to and explain it to you. The first quadrant in the upper left is what we would say, this is from the unchurched non-Seventh-day Adventist. You can see I've divided it into 2 pieces. That means the first piece are those who have never been churched, and the second piece are those who are formerly churched. Now, it used to be that we could say that about 70% of the population in America was formerly church, but that number is moving, and it's getting closer and closer to 50% and even overtaking that quadrant. I think of my next door neighbor, Greg. We used to joke around and we borrowed tools from each other, and we help each other in projects. We drilled a couple wells together in each other's property, and we just did a lot of things. And we decided let's buy a tractor together. Let's just share it. We both had 2.25 acres, and we said, well, it would be really handy if we had a tractor. And so he and I got in the car and we drove to see this tractor that was for sale. And while we were driving, I said to him, I know Greg pretty well. We've lived next to him about 5 years, and I thought, I'm going to just ask him a couple of questions, and just some leading questions, and see where he goes. And I said, when you grew up, did you ever go to church? He says, well, we were C&E Christians. I said, C&E Christians? What's that? He says, Christmas and Easter. We went when we needed to. We went for Christmas, and we usually went for most Easters, but not all the time. But yeah, we were C&E Christians. I said, oh, okay. That's the kind of people I'm talking about who live in quadrant 1. I grew up in the never church category. I didn't know anything about God. I didn't know anything about the message of God. I remember my brother and I, my grandma had given us a small record, 45 record, to play on our little turntable that played 45s. And I believe it was probably the King's Heralds that was singing it. And the song was called The King is Coming. We thought that he was talking about President Nixon was coming to town. We didn't know what it was about. And so we just grew up in this formerly churched category or never churched category. The second quadrant, the blue quadrant at the bottom, is the churched but non-Adventist. Those are the people that go to church. They've always gone to church. They're always going to go to church. They're they're the Methodist Baptitarians. They go to one church down the corner or another one down the road. We used to have some, I do have some Lutheran relatives that when we would go to visit them, we would get up to go play golf on Sunday morning, but they said, well, we're going to go to early church. We always go to early church. Well, why do you go to early church instead of the later one? And this is what my mom's cousin told her. She says, we go to early church so we don't waste the whole day. Wow. That would be the first category. Those are the passive ones. That they're the ones that are saying, yeah, I go to church and I believe it, but it's not really affecting my life. It's not really changing who I am. It's not really developing me. It's not really, I'm not being changed by God's grace. I understand it. I'm a good person, so therefore I'll go to heaven. The second part of the church non-SDA are those who are committed, those who are active, those who are there when the doors are open. They're committed to sharing their faith. I can remember riding the city bus to my high school, and I get on the bus, and when I was a new Adventist, I'd study my Sabbath school lesson as I rode the bus, and this guy sits down beside me, and my feet are in 2 chairs, and I'm sitting there, and he looks over my shoulder and sees that I'm intently reading something about God. And he looks at me and he says, are you saved? You see, a committed Christian wants to see other people saved, wants to share it with somebody else. We have a lady in our church. She was at the library and she was trying to print off a a religious poem, a spiritual poem, because she didn't have a printer at home, so she takes it on a USB stick and she goes to the library and she sticks it in and she can't get it to print. And she can't get the printer to work. And so this guy looks at her and he says, "You need some help with something?" He's thinking he's pretty tech savvy. He's trying to make it print and they can't get the printer to work. And so my church member, she runs down the row to get to the desk and say, "Can you help us with this printer up here?" And the lady gets there and she says, "Oh yeah, you got to do this. You got to log in." And she fixes it. There was some setting on it that she knew how to fix. And she says, "How many copies do you want?" And my church member, she says, "I want 2 copies." And the man that had been trying to help her says, "Could I have a copy too?" "I'm sorry, I was reading your poem and I really like it." She was sharing her faith just by, sharing what was going on at the library. It was kind of an interesting, a little bit of an aside from this talk. He says, "What church do you go to?" Now, she hadn't said she goes to church, but she goes, I go to the Adventist Community Church over on St. John's. He says, "That's the church that's always doing those seminars." She says, "Yeah, it is." He says, "When's the next one? I want to come." And he gives her his phone number so she can let him know. She comes right back to church the next Sabbath, and she asked me, "When's the next seminar?" I mean, it was really cool because he was open to learning some more about God. He was open and learning about what God is trying to do. If you go to the top right quadrant, this is the unchurched Seventh-day Adventist. These are the people who used to be Adventists, used to go to church, maybe grew up in the church school, maybe, did things that they were supposed to do. I've divided it into 3 pieces. And so how do they look? The first group is, these are the bitter ones. These are the ones who are bitter about the way they were raised. Maybe they were kicked out of school. Maybe they were punished for something extra. Maybe they got, too many measurements of their dress hemline or something, but they're bitter. They really have no desire ever to walk into an Adventist church again. They have no desire to live by those standards ever again. The next category of those are those who are passive. These are the people who, I used to go to church. I probably should again someday. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. I don't know. This was my parents. Because my parents were both raised Seventh-day Adventists in the Portland metro, Vancouver, Washington area. And they grew up going to church school. But by the time my brother and I came around, they weren't going to church at all. My dad was smoking. He was drinking. They didn't have any problems with what they ate. They didn't have any problems with that at all. My dad used to invite the Jehovah's Witnesses in to study the Bible because he was going to prove them wrong. And while he's smoking his cigarette and drinking his beer, he's got his Bible open and showing it to him. And he's trying to, he's committed to the message, but he's not committed to coming to church or letting it change his life. Those are the passive people. Those are the ones who, someday I might go back and visit, but probably not now. The third category are those who are close to coming back. These are the people who they do come back once in a while. They do stop and talk, and they might poke their head in and visit even once in a while, but they haven't really made a commitment to come back. In fact, I had a lady come to one of our seminars one time, and she says, I heard you speak one time. I said, "Really? When was that?" She says, "It was at Portland Adventist Academy. You were speaking for your high school reunion, and I was there because I was a former student there also." She's quite a few years older than me, and so she was there for a different class, and she's talking through things with me, and she came to church because she liked what I said at the Academy reunion. But she says, "We used to get these brochures in the mail, and we would laugh with all these beasts on the front of it and stuff. That's those Adventists, and they'd laugh." But she says, "One day I got one of those, and it had some current event stuff in it. It had a couple of beasts in it." And she says, "I'm not getting any younger. Maybe I should take the steps to come back." And she showed up at the seminar. She got baptized. She's active in church now. It's a great thing when you find somebody who's close. The fourth quadrant is this green quadrant. It's the churched Adventist. We've separated that into 3 basic groups of people, the churched Adventists. These are the new people. These are the average church member attender and what I call the DDDs, or the definitely devoted disciples. These are the 3D Christians. These are the ones that are heartfelt. The new people are like a friend of mine. When he showed up at a Revelation seminar that we did at our church in Sweet Home, Oregon, he shows up the opening night and he says to me, "I want to get baptized." Well, I'm thinking, yeah, I'm sure. I want to see you get baptized. I said, let's go to these meetings and let's see. I didn't know that he'd been studying already. Didn't know that he was already convinced of the Sabbath. I didn't know he was already convinced about the state of the dead. I didn't know he already believed in the literal, visible, glorious, and audible second coming of Christ. But he politely waited until the end of the meetings. He got baptized, and I would go see him once in a while. He was a cement contractor. Now, prior to his baptism, he had been losing money every year because most of his profits went into drugs and alcohol. I'd go see him now, and I couldn't find him. I'd go to his job site, and there's his crew pouring concrete, and I'd say, "Where's Vince?" Vince is over there, and I see him. He's leaning against his pickup, and he's talking to the cement truck driver who's just poured all the concrete, and Vince's guys are finishing up the concrete, and he's talking to the cement contractor. You know what he's talking about? He's talking about Jesus, because he wants to share Jesus Christ with him. He's so excited about his newfound faith that he wants to share it with everybody. That's the new people. They are that excited about things. The average church member, those who are attending, are the people that say, "I'll come to church when it's convenient. But don't knock on my door when it's time to do something different. Don't knock on my door when you want extra money. I'll come as long as there's nothing better going on. If the seminar looks interesting, I'll come. If it's going to be new information, maybe I'll show up. But otherwise, I'm just here. Don't get me too involved. I might help pick up the offering once in a while. I might help at the potluck if nothing else doesn't work bad or anything, but I'm going to make sure things are going well." So, and then you have the DDD. These are the people that the Vinces of the world, of what they become, because they get excited about what's going on and they get involved. And I can remember somebody saying to me one time, "Nobody ever comes from that seminar that we did 5 years ago." And I said, "What about so-and-so?" And I named off like 10 people that they were coming because of that seminar. He says, "Really, they're coming?" And what I found out is that people keep coming and they get so involved that the average church member has no idea how they could have ever done church without them. So they must have been here a lot longer than that seminar. But in reality, they've gotten very involved. Interestingly enough, most people find Christ right there in the center. And they find Christ and they begin to follow right there. This is people who are close. This is people who are formerly church. These are people who come from other churches that they're committed. These are the new Adventists, and this is where they come. But look at what's happening. Take a look at the screen, because this is important. Most of what we plan in church is right here around the DDDs, the definitely devoted disciple. This is what our Pathfinder programs are designed for. This is what our church socials are designed for. This is what our potlucks are designed for. When we go for a hike, we only invite our definitely devoted disciple friends with us, because that's the people we enjoy hanging out with. We might talk spiritual things. This is who we're going to have over on a Sabbath afternoon. Almost everything the church does is aimed at these people. But look at this. These definitely devoted disciples, they are the furthest away from the never churched and the formerly churched. That's why these quadrants are drawn this way, to show you how far apart we are from the people we're trying to reach. We are so far removed that we have no idea how to reach them. What would it be like? What would it be like if instead of circling right there around the DDDs and just barely reaching into the average church member, what if we moved that circle? And what if we made it a little bigger to include people in the unchurched non-SDA category and the churched non-SDA category and the unchurched SDA category? What if we designed things for them so that when we said things in church, they would all understand? so that when we went on a hike, they would all understand. See, I learned this lesson the hard way because I was really committed to finding people and reaching them for the sake of Jesus. My brother invited my wife and I on a hike. My brother was a flight paramedic, and he invited a coworker. She was a nurse, flight nurse, and he invited one of the pilots, and we all went hiking together. I knew the pilot. We'd met him before. He was a Christian. My brother was a Christian, a new Christian at the time, and my wife and I mean, I'm a pastor. We're Christians. I just made the assumption that this flight nurse was a Christian too. And so we started talking about God, and we started talking about this and that. And at first, I couldn't tell, but my brother seemed a little uncomfortable at first, and so did the pilot. But they just finally joined into the conversation. And that evening, as we all parted our separate ways, my brother hung around a little bit. And he says to me, "Did you know Lori, the nurse, that she's not a Christian?" I said, "No, really?" He says, "Yeah, I hope we didn't scare her away with all our talk." I said, "Me too." But you know what we did? She came the next shift to work, and she sought out the pilot of the helicopter. She sought out my brother and began asking spiritual questions. What we had done without noticing it is we had shifted that circle. Instead of just being in the holy huddle, we had moved it so that we were talking to people that weren't in that huddle. I learned an important lesson. You don't have to shy away from your Christian faith. You just have to make it understandable and believable to people. I think that's crucial. So I think we start talking about what we do as a church. I think we begin to talk about what we do and why we do it. I think we begin to have a discussion on the church board about how do we design the church service? How do we design our evangelism? How do we understand people? See, I talk to evangelists all the time because they like to assume that their audience is a Christian and that they understand what the Bible themes are. And I'm saying the average person coming to an evangelistic seminar anymore doesn't know those things. They'd like to know those things. That's why they're coming. They see it in the brochure and they open it up and they say, "That looks like something I'd be interested in." And so they share that information. But how do we share it in a way that reaches people who don't know those things? Pathfinders, going on hikes. How do we talk about Ellen White? And using quotes. What if we had a Sabbath afternoon hike that said, "Bring your neighbor with you"? What would it be like if we had a banquet at the church, and the banquet tickets are $15 a person, but it's free if you bring a non-Adventist with you? I think back to my days in Colorado, and we had a church softball team, and as it was getting organized, my friend that was leading out in the organization of the team, he says, "Would the church pay some of the fees?" And I looked at him, I said, I'm willing for the church to pay all of the fees to enter the softball league. He says, "Really?" I said, "Yeah, on 2 conditions. He says, "What's those 2 conditions? I said, "I want to make sure that we don't join the church league." "Really? Why? It's a church team." I said, "Because not everybody on the church league acts like Christians. And so what are we going to do about it?" He says, "Oh, that's true." I said, "If you join the secular league, the non-church league, and somebody doesn't act like a Christian, nobody bats an eye because that's what they expected." He says, "Oh, I like that." He said, "What's the other condition?" I said, "The other condition is that 50% of the team needs to be non-Adventist." Wow. I said, "Listen, if we join a church, this is a church-sponsored team, we're still going to have prayer at the beginning. We're still going to pray for safety. We're still going to pray for God's blessing. We're still going to pray that we live up to God's standard. We're going to encourage people. There may be still people drinking on the other teams. There may be people swearing, but we're going to go out and have fun together." And we saw people get baptized just because of those friendships that were made. We saw several families get baptized. I was privileged to baptize them all at once one time. The guy that ran the softball team stood on the end of 4 people, and I was on the other end of the 4 people. We leaned back at the same time, all 4 of them, and baptized the whole family at once. It was the greatest thing. It was awesome. So, what if we really took this seriously and tried to change the culture of the church so that the church made sense to the non-Christian. I'm not talking about worship styles. I'm not talking about, we have to do a whole lot of different things, but we just get up and explain ourselves every Sabbath morning. So instead of saying, I remember I stood up one day and I said, Happy Sabbath. Stand up, greet your friends, wish them Happy Sabbath. Turns out we had a newspaper reporter in the church that day. And she wrote an article for the local newspaper, said, it was weird. This church meets on Saturday. I was always taught Sabbath was Sunday. So to get up and say Happy Sabbath on a Saturday didn't make sense to me. And I thought, isn't that interesting? So now we say, get up and say hello to people. I mean, we still get people saying Happy Sabbath. That's fine. But I'm telling people we can do the same thing as long as we're explaining what we're doing so that it makes sense to the outsider. So we're not just speaking the insider language. My son is in the United States Navy. And when I talk to him on the phone or he's come to visit or even text message, we talk, and he says, well, I'm doing the SYJ 19. And I'm like, what is that? But if you've ever listened to the military, they have all these abbreviations for things, the SPD, the this and that thing. And, I have no idea what he's talking about. That's what we do as Adventists. And our job as a church, the reason the church even exists is to build a link to the outsiders so that we are pulling people closer and closer. Some of the things that we've done to bring people into church slowly is we've talked about doing service in the community, and we've gone out to the soccer fields on Sabbath afternoon, not because our kids are playing soccer on the teams, but it's hot out on those fields. And we've handed out water bottles. And on the water bottles, it says, we just wanted to show you God's love in a practical way, no strings attached. And that card, you take it out and you pull it over, there's a map to our church and the information about our website and our phone number and that kind of stuff. And we just hand those out as fast as we can. I remember one time we went to the county fair. It was in Greeley, Colorado. And we were standing there at the county fair, and my kids were small. So I carried a cooler of water. It was full of ice and full of water bottles. And every one of these water bottles had one of these tags on it. And I was digging into the water bottles and handing them out to my kids like this. And this lady grabs one. She walks by me and she stops. She looks at it. She says, who is this? And I told her the name of the church. She says, I've heard of you guys. This is so cool. And I'm like, that's why we do it, right? Because we're trying to reach into the community and reach them and build a chain so they can grab a hold and pull themselves and get to church. One time we handed out 9-volt batteries. We just knocked on the door and we had a 9-volt battery with a card on it that said, we just wanted to show you God's love in a practical way. No strings attached. Same card. We handed it to them. We said, we just wanted to remind you to change your smoke alarm batteries. It's only one battery. I've had friends who have done gas buy downs. I go to a gas station, and they'll say, we want to buy the price of the gas down by 25 cents or 45 cents a gallon, and we're going to pay you for it, but we wanted you to lower the price so people will come in, and we want to pump their gas. We want to clean their windshields. We want to give them a little business card that says, we just wanted to show you God's love in a practical way. And so they would go in and they'd pump gas. They had people running all over the station. And then they'd go in and they'd pay the bill at the gas station because the gas station didn't want to lose any money. And the gas station people were, very attentive to it. And the people receiving the card and getting they got their tires checked. They got their windshield washed. It was a great thing. We went to a hospital one time with a whole bunch of flowers. And we just handed out flowers to the staff. It's the people in the hospital that usually get the flowers, right? We handed them to the staff when we handed it to them, my kids would say, we just wanted to say thank you for serving the community here in the hospital. And there's a card attached. Guess what it said? We just wanted to show you God's love in a practical way. No strings attached. They were so responsive and so attentive to that. We've gone to Walmart parking lots with a squirt bottle and a squeegee and cleaned windshields. And on every windshield that we clean, we drop one of these cards in. Just wanted to show you God's love, because what we're trying to do is advertise that we're a church creating links so that they can find Jesus. Isn't that what we're about? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, let's be the hands of Jesus by being the salt of the earth. Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, right? Let's be that salt. I was visiting with a pastor one time who the way he encouraged his members to be the salt of the earth was to go out and learn the lingo, like we've been talking about some today, learn some of the lingo, but go sit on the school board. Go be a PTA member and an active parent involved with it. He had people who worked at medical clinics that did abortions. Now you would say, why is a Christian serving in an abortion clinic? But he was sharing Jesus with the people and trying to talk people out of getting an abortion. He was trying to be the salt. He was trying to intermingle with people but just go out and rub shoulders at school, at work, and everything else. And I think, wouldn't it be nice if we weren't secret agents when it came to sharing our faith? I can remember we were at Crater Lake in Oregon, Southern Oregon, and my wife had a handful of glow tracts, and she was saying, let's go hand them out to the kids. And my kids were pretty good. They just picked them up and went. But my youngest, he wasn't sure he wanted to hand them out, and so he was being a little shy. And he had one of these glow tracts in his hands, and he was only about this tall. And he walked up beside a car that had his window down. And he walked up beside it, and he reached up, and he dropped the glow tract into the car door, and then turned and walked away. The person in the car never saw it. And I thought, that's funny, because she's going to go home, and she's going to be cleaning out her car. And what's this? Where'd this come from? She's not even going to know where it came from. But I think God might be calling us to not be secret about our faith, but to share our faith openly and wonderfully and good. Might be in Bible studies, might be in having a neighborhood barbecue. We used to tell people, come to the barbecue. We're having it at our house. We'd set up a volleyball net in the front yard. Come to the barbecue. We'll grill anything you bring. And now I'm vegetarian, and I would say to the people doing the grilling, make this the vegetarian grill, make this the pork chop grill. I don't care. But I don't care. They weren't ready for the health message at that point. They're not ready to understand all that stuff. And so I'm not there to preach them. I'm there to get my friends, the Christian friends, to intermingle with my non-Christian friends so that they meet each other and say, I know someone at that church and I want to go there. Now, sometimes things get a little sticky when you do that, but relational outreach is when you rub shoulders with people with the intent of someday sharing Jesus with them. It probably isn't going to be the first time you meet them. Sometimes it can be, but not usually. But I think of Jesus. I'm going to play a little bit, if you give me a little bit of freedom to talk. When I think about this a little bit, Jesus calls Matthew the tax collector. And Matthew is so excited because as a Jew and as a tax collector, he was shunned. Nobody wanted anything to do with him. Nobody wanted to talk to him. Everybody hated him because he worked for the hated Romans. In fact, he got rich by making himself rich. If the tax was, 2 coins, he'd charge 4 coins. So he'd put some in his pocket, and he'd put some in the bag, and he'd pay the Romans, and he got paid. Nobody liked tax collectors. I can almost imagine when Jesus walked up and saw Matthew at the tax collector's booth, and he says, come follow me. I almost imagine the disciples behind him going, no, Jesus, don't you know what he does? Jesus calls Matthew, and Matthew is so excited that he decides to hold a party. Imagine, he says, I just want to celebrate. I want to celebrate my becoming a Christian and leaving the tax collector's booth behind. And I'm going to invite all my tax collector's friends. I'm going to invite them in, and we're going to talk about Jesus. We're not going to really get too involved in theology because none of my friends are really interested in that. But if they could meet Jesus like I met Jesus, wouldn't that be an awesome thing? So he invites all his tax collector's friends. The disciples are there, and I just imagine Jesus is walking around talking to people, and Matthew's watching from afar, standing in the corner. He says, there's Jesus. Look, he's going to see my friend Alphaeus, and he's going to talk to him. This is awesome. And he says a quick prayer, and he says, oh, no, there's my buddy Barnabas, and he's going to talk to Peter. I hope Peter watches his mouth. He says some funny things sometimes, says too much. But, and Matthew's just stressing out. He's got that cringe factor going on when you meet Christians and non-Christians, who's going to say something to offend the other party? And are the Christians big enough to get over it? At the end of the night, I just kind of picture everybody's cleaning up. You know, James is stretched out on a couch. He's gone to sleep. It was too late for him. Peter's sweeping the floor, and the other disciples are picking up the tables and cleaning up stuff. And Jesus sits down in a chair next to Matthew, and he puts his arm on his shoulder, and he says, I love your heart. I love your heart. You just invited all these people in just so they could meet and talk to me. What would it be like if we had all these parties where we just invited people to meet our non-Christian friends? What if they got to know 5 or 6 Christians and they were their best friends? I think that's a pretty crucial thing. And I think we have to realize that we need to turn the other way from what the world's going. We're going to use a different language. We're going to use different ideas. We're going to use different methods. We're going to use different things. Maybe we'll have Bible studies or, we'll do other things. But I think if we want our churches to have an outreach mentality, if we want our churches to grow, if we want our churches to understand why we do evangelism and why we do Bible studies and why we believe the things we do, then we need to maybe think through the way we do things. Now, I want to tell you another story. We were, again, having an evangelistic series. We didn't have a place to stay to do it ourselves. We didn't have our own church like we have here today. But we met in a gymnasium for the evangelistic series. We rented a grade school gymnasium. And a guy by the name of Aaron and Stacy were coming. Well, the gymnasium was the size that we needed to have 2 sessions. And so Stacy would come to the first session, and Aaron would come to the second one. And I was like, why are they doing this? Well, what we found out was that their kids had never sat still in a meeting of any kind, and they were so hyper, they couldn't even sit in the kids' meetings where their kids were up and dancing and clapping hands and singing songs and watching things, and they couldn't even handle that. And they were a little embarrassed to have their kids like that. So Stacy would come to the first session, and then Aaron would come and trade the kids off, and then he'd come to the second session. Well, Aaron would stay around and talk to us. And one day I asked him, I said, Aaron, what do you do? He goes, well, I'm in business. I'm like, oh, great. He's an Amway salesman. What are we going to do with that? And Amway salesmen, that's all they ever tell you. Oh, I'm just in business. And then they try to invite you to their house, and they get a whiteboard out, and they start drawing pictures on it. I was like, okay. But we kept talking. We talked about the Sabbath, and he was convicted of it. We talked about the second coming of Christ. He was convinced that we had the truth on it. We talked about the Bible. We talked about tithing. We talked about all these things. There wasn't anything he disagreed with, but he would never fill out a response card. He would never fill out any kind of thing. He never came forward for a call. And on the last night of the meeting, we had made an appointment to sit down and talk with him. And he had agreed. And he says, we sit down, just the evangelist and me and him. His wife's home with the kids already. Just starting small talk, I said, hey, so Aaron, what do you do for work? He goes like this. Okay, here goes. I'm like, what? He says, I own a strip club. I turned to the evangelist, a guy by the name of Hiram Rester. I said, did he say strip mall? He says, no, I said strip club. The kind with the brass poles and the dancers and with the clothing being optional. And he says, I want to join this church, but I can't. Not until I get rid of this strip club. And I own it with my brothers, and we're in a dispute with our stepmom because our dad just died, and she wants to keep the club, and we want to sell it, but we've got to figure out who actually owns it first. And this whole thing comes out. And it was this fascinating story that took him almost 5 years to divest himself of the strip club. When he did, when he got rid of it, he handed me a key as a memory of what it was. This is a key to a strip club. You don't know very many pastors who own a key to a strip club, probably, do you? But it was a memory of what could happen. See, when we do evangelism, as we create a culture of outreach and genuine evangelism within the church, it changes people's lives. But let me tell you this. That was in the city of Fort Collins, Colorado. My friend Aaron's strip club was the only strip club in Fort Collins, Colorado. When we do evangelism, we not only change lives, but we change communities. We even change the whole region. It upset the whole thing within 45-minute drive. Everybody got upset. There was newspaper articles about it, that he eventually sold the building to another church, and they planted a church in a strip club. I think that is just awesome, that God is doing some amazing things. So, I want to just encourage you to take a look at how to reach your community, how to create a culture of reaching and understanding your community and a culture of understanding things. You can find out more about that if you'd like to by getting a hold of my book on Amazon called Evangelism Intelligence. I'm not trying to make a buck. I'll sell them to you at cost if you contact me personally. But it says some of these stories, but it gives some of these concepts of how to create a culture of evangelistic mindset within your congregation. Let's pray. Father God, I want to thank you for a chance to meet with this group of people today, and I pray that you would lead them to understand how to reach their communities and how to understand the terminology and the lingo and the culture of the community so they can reach them in a language that they understand, because it's not always the same as the language we think we're speaking. In Jesus' name, amen.